to it, but thank you. And Wendy has been such an amazing mentor to me. So I'm excited to be here. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. And as Wendy mentioned, the link is in the chat if you want to download the slides and follow along, or for later, so you don't feel like you have to take notes frantically. Okay, so as Wendy mentioned, today I'm going to be presenting on equity literacy, and it is a workshop, so we'll have you do some thinking, because a lot of this concept is about how you might take it up and think about it. So I'm going to present the basics of what equity literacy is, but then give you time to think about what that might look like in practice. And in terms of my own positionality, I'm a white settler. I identify as a cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied woman. And so I feel that I really come to this work, hopefully as an ally, an active ally, and that the experiences of those who are part of equity deserving groups really need to be centered. So I'm honored to present this work as an ally, but we need to really focus on the voices of equity deserving groups when we're thinking about equity literacy. And just to give you my brief spiel about why this is important, so I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows that to effectively prevent dating violence, we have to think about multiple strategies, but most of our strategies in research and practice really focus on the individual level, so building individual skills or knowledge or attitude change. And we're much less effective at changing structural conditions that underlie many experiences of victimization. And we're not going to be effective in preventing dating violence until we address those structural conditions, in addition to building individual skills and capacities. And so the point of this workshop is to explore one tool for addressing those structural conditions called equity literacy. And I'm going to talk about what that is in case it is new to you. I know Wendy gave a land acknowledgement, but I think it's important for me as well to acknowledge the land that I'm very fortunate to reside on. I've, as Wendy said in my introduction, been able to train at a number of places, which means I've benefited from the care and stewardship of a number of Indigenous peoples, and I remain wholly grateful for that. Right now, I live on Treaty 7 territory. Treaty 7 is land that was really taken under false pretenses. The treaty, from the First Nations perspective, was a peace treaty, and that's not how white settlers treated it. And so I think we need to acknowledge that while we benefit, and I benefit from living on this land, it was not taken by peaceable means. And I think another important part of land acknowledgement is identifying what we're doing as part of reconciliation. And so right now for me, that means donating to nativeland.ca, which is a great resource, as well as the Indian Residential Schools Survivors Hotline, and rereading the TRC. And so if you can donate, I encourage you to do that as part of reparations. And if not, everyone's in a different place, then consider writing to your MP to urge them to implement the 94 calls to action. And so I'm very grateful to be presenting on the land that I'm on today. So in our webinar/workshop, I'm going to give a brief overview of what equity literacy is and then put you to work. So we're going to do a case study on equity literacy and dating violence prevention. Then we're going to think about both as a group, and I'll give some thoughts on incorporating equity literacy into prevention practice. And then I have some resources at the end. So I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you. And just except for when I'm presenting and the Q&A at the end, we will be pausing the recording, so other discussions won't be recorded, just so you know that. Okay, so what is equity literacy? So I think to start, I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with the concept of equity, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is equity? So equality is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, which of course isn't true. And I'm sure you've seen a version of this image before. So in equality, everyone gets the same height support, which works for some people, but for the little guy in the yellow shorts is not enough. And so equality will not lead to fair and just outcomes. Equity, on the other hand, means that everybody gets the supports that they need. So now our little guy in the yellow shorts can see over the fence because they're getting the supports that they need. Equity includes the concepts both of equal services for equal need, so that's known as horizontal equity, as well as enhanced services for greater need, so vertical equity. So that would mean everybody in this picture who is the height of the red shirt person would get the single box they need, and then people who are the height of the yellow shorts person get that extra support because that's what they need. So equity is good, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But of course, what we're moving towards, hopefully, is justice. And so here we no longer need those different services and supports because we've actually addressed the cause of the inequity so that everyone can participate fully without the accommodation, which in this picture are the boxes. So that's really our goal, is to move towards justice and addressing root causes of inequities, both through the fair distribution of services and resources, as well as a fair process for that distribution. And so we'll be talking about concepts of equity today, but the goal of equity literacy is really to remove those structural and systemic barriers to create fair and just outcomes. So equity literacy has 4 components. So I'm going to go through each of those, and then a number of principles, and I'm going to talk about those as well. So the first principle of equity literacy is that we are able to recognize oppression. And this is something that we can help the youth that we work with to build, and of course also that we are hopefully continually building in ourselves. So if you're an equity literate dating violence facilitator, you might notice subtle bias in prevention materials and in group interactions in your group of youth. Showing curiosity about how your community or school policies and standard practices might be disadvantaging some youth in either unintentional or intentional ways, and rejecting deficit views that outcome inequalities, so in this case, more dating violence victimization, for example, are the results of the cultures or mindsets of certain students and not due to these larger structural oppressions. So this is sort of the base level of equity literacy. And certainly by being here today, you are contributing to recognizing oppression that can exist within dating violence prevention practice. So the next level up is to respond. So once we've noticed it, we need to do something. And respond really refers to what we're going to do thoughtfully in the immediate term. So these are short-term solutions. And so this can be, and this is what we're going to talk about in the case study today, brainstorming in the immediate term, what do we do in this moment to respond to oppression that we see? When we're working with youth, this can mean specific skills practice opportunities so that students know how to respond when they see and hear things that perpetuate oppression. So you might do that in your program through, for example, bystander training, so they know what to say and do. For facilitators, this can include things like really training to develop the facilitation skills as well as the content knowledge necessary to intervene when they're working with youth and other adults when biases and inequities arise. It can mean building skills with youth so that they have the ability to analyze bias and inequity in program materials, much like we do with media literacy. And it can mean fostering conversations with your colleagues about equity concerns in your prevention work. So recognizing and responding in the short term is very important, but we also need to think about how we're going to redress bias, discrimination, and dating violence by thinking about how bigger social change can happen. So this is more of the long-term move towards justice. So how are we as dating violence prevention practitioners, researchers, facilitators, thinking about changing these root causes that underlie dating violence, like racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and things like that. So thinking about, how are we advocating against inequitable practices? How are we teaching about sexism, poverty, racism, ableism as part of our dating violence prevention work? How are we advocating for large-scale social change on those issues? And it also means we don't confuse diversity with equity. So we don't want to respond to, for example, issues of racism or racial conflict within our group with a cultural celebration. So it really means targeting the root causes to create long-term change. And then finally, if we've done that and hopefully we've moved towards long-term change, we need to cultivate and sustain bias and discrimination-free communities. So kind of that continued work to keep it going. So thinking about, how are we communicating with families, understanding that youth have different access to resources, continuing to prioritize the needs and barriers experienced by youth who are marginalized by structural conditions when we're making any decision about policy and practice. So just thinking through an equity lens a daily part of our practice. And so today we're going to really be focusing more on the recognize and respond pieces in our discussions. But I think in our second activity, which will be a Jamboard, we can start to hopefully think about these larger scale social changes and how we might do that within our prevention work. So those are the 4 components of equity literacy: recognize, respond, redress, cultivate, and sustain. And now I'm just going to go over some underlying principles. And I should say this all comes out of Paul Gorski's work, and I'm going to give you some resources at the end. He has a very accessible website with handouts that go over all of these things, some of which Stacy posted in the chat. So you don't need to be memorizing what I'm saying. I'll direct you to a website that has all of this for you. So the first principle of equity literacy is direct confrontation. So this means that there's no path to equity that doesn't involve a direct confrontation with inequity. So we can't just be passive, we have to be active allies and bystanders. And so we have to directly confront interpersonal, institutional, and structural oppressions such as racism. And if we don't directly confront that inequity through our policies and practices and programming decisions, then we're actually playing a significant role in sustaining inequity. So we need to take an active role in this work, in this case, within what we're doing for dating violence prevention. The second principle is this idea of culture of poverty, which is a concept from social theory that really asserts that it's the values of people experiencing poverty that play a significant role in perpetuating their impoverished condition, sustaining a cycle of poverty. When from an equity perspective, we know that it has nothing to do with the values of people. It has to do with power and privilege problems, not cultural problems. So through an equity literacy lens, we center both our understanding of problems as well as our understanding of solutions within an understanding of power and privilege. And although this refers specifically to this idea of culture of poverty, we can think of it extending to anywhere where people talk about issues arising from vague cultural things. So it's something wrong with that group. And in an equity literacy lens, we reframe that to be about what's wrong with our structures and what's putting a particular group into a disadvantaged position. And so I still hear this idea come up a lot when I'm talking with different groups. There's something about those people. And so I think this is something we have to continue to push people to think differently and to understand what the actual source of inequity is. And this is for thinking about power and privilege. This actually isn't in your slides, but I'm happy to send the link out if anyone wants it. It's a version of a power and control reel that I really like. So the closer you are to the center, the more privilege you hold in society because of these social structures. And so this can be a powerful tool for helping people to understand where that power and privilege stems from, and why certain groups are disadvantaged as compared to other groups due to social and structural conditions. And this source is from the Canadian Council for Refugees. Okay, so the third principle is equity ideology, which I've mentioned already. So we'll talk about some strategies today, but equity is much more than a list of practical strategies. And I see this a lot. I'm the co-chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee in my department, and we just get from our faculty, like they just want a list of what to do. And that's part of it. There are things they need to do, but it's really about a lens and an ideological commitment. It's how we see the world. It's our worldview. It's how we understand problems, and it's how we understand solutions to those problems. And there, you can't strategize your way out of inequity. We have to deepen our understandings of where inequity comes from, along with doing practical things to address inequity. Prioritization. So this means that for every decision we make, in this case, in terms of dating violence prevention activities, we have to think about how will this affect the most marginalized members of our community. And depending on where you're working and with whom, that will be different, but constantly asking for every decision we're making, how is it going to affect those who are socially marginalized, and how can I address that in my decisions? So equity is really about prioritizing the needs and interests of the most marginalized members of your community. Redistribution. So I think this kind of goes back to that direct confrontation. So sometimes people are willing to do things for equity, but not go this far. So we have to directly make changes. It's not about just thinking nice thoughts. We have to directly change what we're doing. And so equity requires the redistribution of material, cultural, and social resources, opportunities, access. And so if we can't explain how our equity initiatives are redistributing access and opportunity, we should reconsider them and think about if they're really promoting equity, or if we're just sort of making it look that way and not actually doing equity work. Another principle is fix injustice, not kids. So this kind of goes back to that idea of culture of poverty. So we see outcome disparities like increased experience with dating violence, not being the result of deficiencies in communities' culture, mindsets, or their grittiness, which is one I particularly like. They're just not tough enough, but it's a cause of these larger social inequities. And so equity initiatives focus not on fixing marginalized people, but on fixing the conditions that marginalize people. And so in our dating violence prevention work, we have to think about how are we addressing those conditions that lead to a higher risk of dating violence. One size fits few. So no individual identity group shares a single mindset, value system, communication style. And so we do have identity specific equity frameworks that can help us to understand how we might go about adapting or creating dating violence prevention tools. But it's really important to remember that there are many individuals within that group and that each of them is going to have different needs. And this really ties back to the concept of intersectionality. So our experience is very much shaped by the many identities that we hold. And so within our programs, if we're using some of these larger identity-specific equity frameworks, we still want to think about what individual youth that we're working with might need. And then finally, equity, evidence-informed equity. So equity initiatives should be based on evidence for what works as opposed to trendiness. And just evidence can mean many things. It can mean quantitative research. It can mean stories and lived experiences of people. It can mean art. It can mean lots of different things. So, but you want to draw on the evidence that's relevant to the communities that you're working with in terms of what they need to achieve equity. So that's just a brief overview of some principles. And again, they're in the handouts that Stacy shared if you want to take those with you. And so now we're going to move actually into a case study to help you foster your recognizing and responding skills. Oh, yes, and Stacy just posted the case study. Thank you, Stacy. And so what is the point of this case study? It's really to help notice bias in program materials and group interactions, to help you show curiosity about the ways that some of our prevention practice could disadvantage some students, to develop facilitation skills, to intervene effectively when bias is noticed, and then to foster conversations about how you would respond in this situation. And I wrote this case study, but I actually adapted it from this book, Case Studies on Diversity and Social Justice Education, which I believe is free to download. These case studies are great. They just focus a lot more on education. So I just adapted the scenario on sexual orientation to be about a dating violence scenario. So I will read it and then I'll show you the questions, and then you will go into breakouts for 15 minutes and then come back and we'll have just a general discussion, kind of things you noticed, questions that came up, that kind of thing. And the thing about all of these case studies is there's no easy answers, there's no right answer. And so it's really thinking about those equity principles and how you would bring that to this scenario. Okay, So here's our scenario. So the dating violence prevention program you are using suggests doing dating role plays to get youth comfortable interacting with a potential romantic partner. The youth in your group giggle a bit, and one of them, Tim, says, "I hope we get to choose our partners. I'm not gay. I'm quitting if I get paired with a guy. That's just wrong." Some of the youth in your group laugh along, while a few others try to change the topic back to the activity. Another member of your group, Sarah, raises her hand to ask if the group can make a ground rule that only students of the opposite sex are paired together for the activity to avoid the kind of situation Tim is talking about. The rest of the youth in the group look at you, waiting for a response. And so that's posted in the chat, so you'll have that in the breakout. And so these are just some ideas of questions you might want to think about. It's your time, you can really talk about whatever you'd like, but at which point in the session should you have intervened? How or why would you have intervened? Why might some students have found that funny and laughed along? How does having a dating role play encourage gender bias and homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, and heteronormativity? Who might be offended? What would you do to change this if you knew this was coming up in your curriculum? Or anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of how to improve this activity from an equity literacy lens. So I'm going to stop my share, and then Stacy is going to put you in. There we go. Okay, don't need that. Okay. Yes, so we did our Jamboard, and feel free to keep adding, and we'll send that out. And so just to close, I'm going to give a couple ideas. There are so many on the Jamboard, and some of them already talk about this. And I think that's the main sort of takeaway is there's no guide on how to do this as part of dating violence prevention. You're really writing the script through what you're doing as part of this community of practice. And so I think talking to people who are doing this work, what are they doing, what's working well, is just a really critical part of it, because there's no sort of predefined steps about how to do this well within dating violence prevention. So, a key thing is professional development. So we have to be able to recognize and respond ourselves. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this webinar, but doing our own PD in areas where we're lacking and only we can kind of know that, committing to unlearning and relearning, committing to an equity lens. We need to do that work, and there's lots of tools out there to help us do that. And I'll mention a few at the end. But making that sort of the first place to start is doing our own work. In terms of recognizing, and we talked about this, and Sarah talked about this as well, working with youth who are your key stakeholders, as well as others in the community, for example, elders, to review what you're doing for your dating violence prevention work through an equity lens, and get their input and feedback and ideas about, well, what could we do instead? And this is really important because most of our programs, as I mentioned, were designed with and for majority youth. And so this may serve to unintentionally, mostly, and hopefully not intentionally, it doesn't really matter because it's about impact, not intent, serve to further marginalize equity deserving youth because they don't see themselves or their needs or their experiences in our program content. So including their voice in program adaptations and program review is really critical, and often they'll note things that maybe we didn't even see as being problematic. In terms of redressing and cultivating, beyond working with youth to make sure they see themselves in our prevention work. If they don't, we can then adapt that curriculum, and we have a guide as part of the community of practice on adapting programs. So, often it means making materials inclusive. So do the faces in our prevention materials look like the faces of the youth that we're working with? This one can seem very basic, but it's super important, especially if you're working with a pre-existing curriculum. Adapting role plays, and I think someone talked about that, and I can't remember who, but having youth sort of write prompts or make ideas for role plays that really fit the context of their lives. And then really viewing existing role plays and curriculum with a critical lens, whether that's about dating, as we talked about in our case study, or even something like if case studies talk about having a two-parent home or a mom and a dad. So, what would that mean for kids with a single parent or two same-sex parents and who are in diverse family structures, living with grandparents and aunts and uncles. So just really thinking through all of that material through an equity lens. Customizing information, and this is also came up on the Jamboard, to include an explicit consideration of sexism, poverty, racism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia. So talking about how that links to dating violence, which is not something that's in any curriculum that I know about. So if you're doing that work, that's awesome. And again, you're really on the leading edge of effective prevention, but making sure that that's integrated in a developmentally appropriate way in our curriculum, removing any information that takes a deficit view of certain groups. And if you're using an existing curriculum, this could very well be in there. So making sure that differences between groups in terms of dating violence are really rooted in a structural understanding. And all of these things, making materials more inclusive, adapting role plays, customizing information, are what we call green light adaptations, meaning they don't compromise the integrity of the program, and they're safe and encouraged to do because they will better meet the needs of the population we're serving. And this is just a 7-step process to think through equity literacy. It's a lot of stuff we've already talked about. So when reviewing curriculum or doing a case study or thinking through a critical incident, thinking about first problems that are immediately apparent, as well as those that might be a bit more hidden. And this is where it's important to do that pre-work, taking that time to reflect about the potential biases that might exist, prejudices, assumptions in the material we're working with. And there's no, wrong answers here. This is where we can bring in the youth as well as other key stakeholders that we work with. Taking stock of various perspectives as part of identifying biases and inequities in our materials. So who are the obvious stakeholders, and then who are the less obvious stakeholders that we might want to hear from in terms of how our materials are meeting their needs, and if they're just and fair. Thinking about how different stakeholders are experiencing the opportunities and the different situations in our curriculum. Thinking about both challenges and opportunities. So perhaps it's a bad activity. What are the challenges with that? How can we build on it as an opportunity to introduce equity into our prevention materials? How can we take it as an opportunity to change policy around dating violence prevention? So using our identification of biases and the various perspectives we've heard from to inform challenges and opportunities. Imagining what a fair and equitable solution to this situation might look like, which is what you did in the case study. And there's no easy answers and there's no one answer. And as we heard, it really depends on the context of the group you're working with, who's there, what training do the facilitators have, what's the pre-work that's been done, but really thinking about how to ensure fairness across the group we're working with. Brainstorming immediate response. So what are you going to do right now? So this is really responding in the short term to address the problems to ensure that equitable and just outcomes will be reached. And then what might you do in the longer term to mitigate the inequity? So maybe if you did that role play activity, what would you be doing right now in the moment with youth to address it? And then what would be your longer term response in terms of redressing the larger issues? And then based on possible responses, both now and later, what's going to be your specific plan of action? And these 7 steps were designed to go through a case study activity, but I think they can be more broadly applied to equity generally. And so finally, resources, again, there's no how-to list. These are some things I find helpful. I'm sure given who's in this room, you could suggest 100 other things. And so, the most important thing I think is that where you hold privilege, it's your responsibility to do the work and learn more, to unlearn and relearn. And it's not the responsibility of those experiencing marginalization to do it for you. So there's this article, it's very short, Equity Literacy for All. This really focuses more on education, but if you wanted to read more about this concept, if you Google that, it will come up, it's free to download. I think reading, in terms of doing that work, these are some books I've been reading recently that I like. They're pretty basic, but they focus Policing Black Lives and The Skin We're In both focuses on the Canadian context, which I really appreciate. And I'm sure there are many others that you could suggest, and feel free to type those in the chat, but doing this as part of that recognizing. There's lots of courses you can take, toolkits, trainings. You can do bystander training. You could take gender-based analysis for more of that policy analysis lens through an equity perspective. I mean, there's a million things out there, so it's really doing the work that you need to do to help incorporate that into your prevention curriculum based on where you're at right now. And then these are just 3 websites. So equityliteracy.org, if you go there, that has tons of handouts. Everything I talked about today is on that website. Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, has a lot of ideas about activities we can do with youth, particularly around facilitating discussions about structural oppression. And then on the PrevNet website, the Youth Dating Violence website, we have a number of resources, including a whiteboard on intersectionality and dating violence that might be useful to you as well. And then the last slide is just my contact information in case you had any questions, but now I will stop and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Hey, thanks to Deinera. We really appreciate it. And it was a very thoughtful presentation. I had to run in and out. I have a misbehaving dog, so I apologize. I missed about 5 minutes. Does anyone have any questions, or they can either put up their hand or jump in or put in the chat?
Does anyone, maybe in addition to questions, like have any other resources they would recommend that's like help them in this work that they might want to share with the group? So Shreen asks, and I'll throw this back to you, but is there any way to help facilitators expect the unexpected, like the scenario we discussed earlier? I have a few thoughts, but I know there's people in the room who had more direct experience. So maybe I'll open it up and then I, can share my thoughts if that's useful. So do people, like, what can we help facilitators do? Because no matter how well we plan, like they're going to have to respond to these things in the moment. So what can we do to help them?
One thing we've done at McCreary, we have youth co-facilitators on this, and we have on other projects in the past, we do an exercise called Facilla Nightmares, where we kind of come up with those scenarios that are common, where things kind of go wrong, and we practice through a little bit of role play, I'll say, but we practice actually using the language and like pretending you are facilitating to practice saying it. Because I think, you can talk about what you would do and everything, but actually practicing it and saying the words is a little bit different.
Totally. Yeah, I think that
I love that title.
Yeah. That opportunity to practice is so key. I think it's just this like, when your brain, I know my brain freezes and it's like, I don't even know where to start. So doing that and kind of lowering that response and being ready or feeling ready, I think is great. Other thoughts on how we can help facilitators prepare? So I think, the role, like having practice is so critical. I think, facilitators sharing with you, so making a space where they can share, especially if they're not all at the same organization, because I think these things come up and then you might get a sense too of like where they commonly come up and where they don't. If you're using an implementation checklist for your sessions, you could add sort of a section on that, like what are the common challenges? And then if you're analyzing that, you might be able to see like, oh, this activity is always leading to some problems and we can adapt it versus, this was a one-off type of thing. And then we can use that as an example to help train facilitators to be ready, like us facilitators, like all of us continuing their unlearning and relearning process. So if you're able to, within the structure of your organization, giving them that time to do some of that personal development work and talk about that, because I think it's about the practice, but it's also about this larger piece of how do you understand these inequities and where they come from. So those are just a few thoughts. And I think the idea, and I saw it on the Jamboard as well, of co-facilitation, if you're able to do that. We know that's a best practice for a lot of reasons. And I think also in this, like if you need to respond to something, having someone else who can help you or sort of take over the group while you deal with a certain situation can be really helpful.
Yeah, I like what you said about doing their own professional development. We try to also concentrate on having staff do trauma work. And also, we have non-Indigenous staff as well, and it's important to educate them in some of the systems and barriers that our youth have that maybe they have not experienced before.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think that's so do they know the community they're working with and sort of some of the issues that community, not just globally, but locally as well. Like, what are the issues? Can they understand? I think that's important. And yeah, our facilitators themselves carry these identities, and like hearing this stuff can also be, super difficult when you belong to that community. So what are the supports in place, not just to prepare facilitators to do it, but then after to help them work through it? Because of course, youth are going to say things that are difficult. And, what are the supports we're offering to facilitators to help them do their own healing from what they might hear when working with youth? Right.
Awesome. I might just hop in to build on
totally
something Sarah was saying, but I think being aware of signs and symptoms of trauma and how that manifests, and having maybe some healing centered work, I find that can be really helpful, because sometimes if we have a young person who, might be responding in a way where we think they're not listening or perhaps aren't as engaged, we really might understand that through a lens of trauma. And I think that helps with everything you've been talking about in terms of bringing the equity lens as well to the facilitating.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. I even thought, like in the scenario today, like I wanted to put it in because it is something that comes up, but I knew for some people in the room that like scenario would hit very close to who they are and home. So and so I think even if we're doing that work around the role playing, like then what is sort of the after part about helping people debrief and talk about that? Because even if it's hypothetical, that's still, it reflects what's actually happening in the real world. And so I really like that. Yeah, like building in that healing centered practice and helping facilitators know about that. Okay. This has been great. Any final thoughts, questions, anything you want to debrief on or talk about? Well, I want to thank all of you very much for coming today and for your dedication to this work. I think a change is coming in dating violence prevention, and you really are the change. So I think it's awesome that you're thinking about this. There is an evaluation. Stacey's posted the link in the chat. As we said, it's really helpful for us to get feedback. What's helpful to you? What would you like to see? And also, as you all know, because you're funded by PAC, they like to see it too. So if you could do that, that would be great. And I'll stay on if there's any questions, but thank you so much for giving us your time today.
And a huge thank you to you for a great and entertaining and interactive